my first question, I saw on your website that you describe yourself as a conservatory trained composer with a punk rock heart, which I loved. You are the third composer that I've interviewed in 3 weeks who has punk rock roots. So I'm very curious what it is about punk rock that keeps leading you guys into the film composing world.
Bad luck, good luck. I don't know. I started off producing bands. I was classically trained. Um, as you say, first off, I still have a website. I must speak to my team. When was the last time we updated? 1953. Okay, good. Yeah, I studied at the Conservatoire in Scotland. And at the same time, I started producing bands. I was doing string arrangements on bands and stuff like that. And I never knew. I've always written music. My mum's a music teacher,
Mhm.
so I've always been involved in music, but I never knew what I wanted to do. I just knew that I loved writing music, and my teacher had said when I was kind of 17, 18, was like, "Where do you go and study?" He's like, "Well, what do you want to study?" I was like, "I don't know. I just love doing music." So he was like, "Well, there's this cool place, the Conservatoire. They've just got a new film music course, and I'd always loved music for film,
Mm.
but knew jack shit about it. So I went up there. Teacher buggered off after a term to Hollywood to go and try and make it. I was like, what am I supposed to do? So while I was there was a studio in Glasgow called Savannah, and there were loads of bands there. It was
Mm.
like Mogwai and Snow Patrol and Arab Strap and Isabel Campbell from Bell and Sebastian. And I just started working with them. I was the classical dude. Oh, he can do strings, so come and do strings on it. And I just loved it, and I learned so much about the studio experience. But I never. It's weird, like the things that form us. Like I'm trying to condense this answer, but like the things that form us as composers or as artists or as producers or whatever you are, you think that everybody has that same knowledge. So you get frustrated, not frustrated, but it's like, well, why do you do drums like that? That doesn't make any sense. Or why do you do this like that? It's like, well, because I've never been in a room with drums. And because for me, it was just natural because I was working with bands.
Yeah.
So I had a classical background, but then I was working with bands, and it just became this natural progression to kind of fuse them together. And obviously, that just has, as anything does, an impact on where you go. So I started getting a couple of short films. This director who's now Oscar nominated, but who's like, well, I like the fact that you work with bands. Here, come and do my film. So that's always seems to be the case that the film guys like the fact that you work with bands, then the bands like the fact that you work with films. So like, it's just in the end, music is music, isn't it? It's just a cool thing for people to enjoy.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how did you get involved with the documentary team for Last Breath, the first go around, and then how did you get roped back in?
Rose back. um, it's a good question. The documentary, there was a producer called Angus Lamont who's in Glasgow. The three deep sea divers were from Scotland, it was up north in Aberdeen. Um, and he got in touch and said, "Hey, look, I know you're in LA. I've still got a studio in Glasgow. She's like, I know you're in LA, but I'd love you to meet these filmmakers we've got at this fantastic story." And he sent me the doc, and I vaguely knew Angus from years ago. They'd
Mhm.
done some stuff, but it's not like we were mates or anything. So he'd sent it over, and I mean, the story is just bonkers, as you know. Yeah, the story is just completely bonkers. And I was like, this is true. Yeah. And again, I'm going to try and not do any spoilers in this interview. But during that documentary, the way that Alex Parkinson, the director, had
Mhm.
shot it was not like any documentary I'd ever done before. And I worked with Errol Morris, I worked with lots of people, everyone has their own styles. But he shot this kind of like a feature, but a doc, but you didn't quite know what you're watching, which is also very much like Errol's style. But then something happens in it. Anyway, so it got me into it, but I scored it like a film. I didn't score it like a documentary. And there is a big difference because documentaries, you're trying to leave room for voiceovers a lot of the time.
Mhm.
And so that can sometimes mean that you lose some of the emotion. Whereas scoring a film, you're subtle, you write it, you bring out those emotions. And it's always funny. A lot of people said about the documentaries that if you were to watch that without music, we're not sure that it would be the same kind of film. That's not a bad thing,
Mhm.
but it's different, but the music leads you and it feels like a film, and every character's got their own styles and so on. So it was just wonderful. And it was one of those slow burners because loads of people started seeing it on plane journeys, bizarrely enough. And they
Oh,
go like, hey, I've just watched it. You know, those kind of ones where you're on a flight and going like, got nothing else to do. Oh, what I'll watch is about someone running out of oxygen. Not a good idea.
yeah, no, it's a terrible plane movie.
You might go for rom-coms, Tina. Yeah, some people go for those. But yeah, so the documentary was absolutely wonderful. I loved every second of it. And then Alex, the director, got in touch about whenever it was, 4 years later, and said, "Oh, it's being turned into a movie." And I was like, "Well, how do you differentiate between the two?" Because I think one of the things that made the documentary so wonderful was that you were so close up to the story of these divers. For those of you who don't know, it's about a diver goes underwater, his oxygen tank, for want of a better phrase, is cut and he's 2 miles underwater or whatever. And it's like you're supposed to be able to last for what, 6 minutes without breath. And this is going like the clock's like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And he's left alone. And then the people have got to try and find him underwater. I mean, it's absolutely insane. So there is a danger in my head anyway that you then over Hollywoodize that. And it becomes, and for me, the thing that you got from the documentary was just you were so close to these divers and the silence that you get when you're under that water 2 miles down, I would imagine. But that's, you're trying to blend your music with that. So that was always the thing I said to Alex is like, look, if you want me to do it, let's not make it this totally cheesy Hollywood thing. Let's actually keep to kind of the authenticity of it. It's about those characters because that claustrophobia, how you must feel when you're underwater, that far down in the pitch black, left alone to die. Oh.
So I did have a question, but about like the difference between scoring a documentary and a narrative feature, and you kind of answered it. But if you scored the documentary not like how you would traditionally score a documentary, you're essentially creating a narrative score twice. So what was that experience like for telling the same story but different styles of presenting it?
As far as between the doc and the feature, the different
Yeah,
styles. So the two are completely separate. It's not like I've taken themes from one and put on the
right.
other. They're completely different scores.
But how does that like I just feel like it would be hard to like do that twice, to have similar material, similar starting point, and to produce two entirely different scores.
It's a really good point. Um, I suffer face blindness. So like when I see people in a bar or in a coffee shop, or whatever,
I'm the
and
same way.
you know what I mean? It's
100%.
just like
Yes.
so they all come up. Paul, I'm like yeah. It's like, I spoke to you yesterday on Zoom. Oh, yes, John. And I have a similar thing with when I'm scoring a movie, which
Ah.
is that if you watch it too many times, you become immune to what you're watching. So
Mm.
when I start scoring a movie, I like watching it twice and then just switching it off. And
Mm.
then you go and write kind of thematic material on what your emotional reaction is to something. And I think what made it easy to differentiate between the film is that the two characters themselves are, as such, actors, but they are in it the whole time. In the documentary, you're cutting from the story to people being interviewed to this to that. Whereas in this, you are very much following the story of the divers straight off. You got the three main divers, Finn and Cebu and Woody. And so you're automatically caught up in their story. And what then the film does is that submersible is connected to the ship right above on the water. You've got this massive ship, and again, the characters in there. So it's almost like you're introducing different themes. You got one for the main ship up above, this huge beast. You got the sound of the engines. You got all of that, and then it's a very different vibe because you're then down in this teeny tiny. I mean, submersible. I don't know what you call it, but you got that which then goes down, and then your sense of pressure. It's so pressurized. You're underwater for a month. I mean, I don't know how these divers do it. It's insane.
Yeah.
Um, I would struggle with my own company for a day, let alone two other people's for a month. So you're in there, and the sound is such you've got the squeaks, the pressure of the cabin going in. So the sound, you've got this big difference between this massive boat, the waves, the storm, to then underneath, and then to even less, there's one lonely diver on the seafloor. So it makes it quite easy then from a film point of view because you're really reacting and identifying with those three main characters. Whereas I feel that the documentary, although you're identifying with the three main characters, it's as much about the story itself.
Mhm. And you use a lot of low brass in the film score, which I love. I played sousaphone in high school,
Oh,
so
nice.
yeah, I always love a low brass. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose to highlight it? Because the low brass isn't always, the
Sure.
the focal point that it should
Well,
be.
first off, I feel we need to discuss why did you choose the sousaphone?
So my sister actually still plays music. She's in a bunch of like orchestra bands. She's the music one in the family. She played percussion. I didn't have the musical gene. I was also forced into percussion. I got sick of helping to unload all of the marching band drums off of the bus.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, what's
Well, I'll go
also,
for the biggest brass
yeah.
instrument out. What a great idea. You could have just gone a vocalist and got a microphone in a band,
So then I just picked sousaphone because it was also loud and I guess I don't know. I don't know how I got there, but I had fun.
Next time, soprano sax, you're good. Why did I go for low brass? Because there is something ominous about it. And the score itself, it kind of has three threads. It has the big orchestra.
Mhm.
That was great. We got a couple of days with the big orchestra. And that's the kind of the heroic moments. We have electric cello. Yerda in Israel recorded that, where he was it's very much kind of edgy and there's lots of delay on it. It's kind of yes and for me, the way that I always described it to Alex was look, it's like the sound of a whale in the distance.
Mm.
It's utterly ridiculous because it's not about whales and there's no whales there or anything else, but it's just like if you're underwater, what are the creepy effects that you would have? Yeah, I've done a bit of diving, nothing like these guys, but you do hear weird things in the distance. You're not quite sure what it is. So I said, well, look, let's make a scared version of that almost. So that's the kind of really ominous. You hear this kind of delays, and it really gets you on the edge of your seat, and you're not sure why. So that was cool. But the low brass for me was like, well, what sound can I put? It's more chordal than tuned, to be honest, in the brass.
Mm.
It's more the sound kind of underneath this crescendo and decrescendoing. And for me, the sounds that cut across this, there's so much effects in this film, as far as kind of water, as far as underwater, as far as the actual breathing itself. And you don't want to interfere with that because it's so effective. When the music suddenly cuts out, you just get the breath. It's cool.
Mhm.
So you can either have top endy stuff, hi-hats, or for me, as I say, I sample up a boat and kind of did that. That was a rhythm. So I kind of made a sample out of that and made this like a ticking clock running out of time. But when that disappears, what are you going to have sonically underneath? And I wanted it to be real instruments for that part. So I was like, well, I'll tell you what cuts really well is just this low ominous brass that comes out of nowhere. So I've got a synth every time that comes with it, and then it covers up the intro, so you don't hear the brass coming in because you just hear this kind of wah. Brass comes up, brass comes down. But for me, it's something that really gets you in the pit of your stomach.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Maybe that's why I liked it because I always liked horror movies and that's what a sousaphone's good for.
But it's used in a kind of when again you try and think about how you use sounds to create themes,
Yeah.
and themes can be a tune, themes can be a motif, themes can be it's just something that it's like Pavlov's bell where you recognize it coming in
Yeah.
every time. So I like that when you got things that you can identify with. So it's more again the feel of this, and it does change chord and so on. But if you were to have strings playing that, for me, that's too nice.
Right.
And I love my strings. And so again, the heroic stuff, that's all fine. But when you've got that kind of ominousness, there's such a word, ominousness. When you got that, I really like that sort of coming underneath.
Yeah, I agree. My last question for you. I read that you sampled a dripping tap that was somehow processed through a vocoder synth. For people who don't understand music, what does that mean? And then why did you decide to
It was a
build
good idea.
the main theme around that?
Well, first off, do you call it a tap over here or do you call it a faucet? Because I'm trying to change my kind of language so that people understand. Do you call it taps?
I think we call it both.
The whole faucet thing, I will never learn, but I'm trying to call it that because when Alex is British, the director, so we're
Yeah.
chatting away, and I'm speaking to the producers, and they're going, "What the hell's a tap?" And it's like, you know, a tap. And it's like, no, not a tap. So anyway, so it was like a dripping faucet. So there you go.
Yeah.
Um, because when you try again, trying to come up with the sound of a theme, you want it somehow. And it's like it's not a massive thing, but it's something that really sort of brings it in. So say in the same way that you went down instead of kind of going like on a drum machine,
Mhm.
because it's for me drums date really quickly as well. So it's not they're good, it's not they're bad, but electronic drums in particular, it can kind of keep you in the Beverly Hills Cop, the 80s. You know, you have the 90s, you have the two. There's certain sounds that are synonymous with a certain era. So I try and steer away from that as much as possible. So as I say, so I've gone down, I sampled the boat and just like whack some stuff against the side of it. You know, you're down there with your microphones and stuff. And contact, which is the thing that we all used as a sampler, you kind of use that sound and make you can then play it on your keyboard. So if it's record you saying hello, 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 and simply hello, 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 hello. So that's fine using vocals. That's what we do when we do bands and stuff like that. But then what's cooler is you take that sound, for example, the boat, and then you can then turn it into a drum machine yourself. So I was like, okay, well, that's all fine. But thematically, going back to that whole strings thing
Mhm.
versus the brass thing, and you got the say the electric cello, what is it, the sound of the main tune where the opening of the whole film? And when I've been down, bizarrely enough, this is the way that all of us composers work. Our brains just go off at tangent. When I was down at the boat and I was hitting things, there was a kind of repercussion of this, literally a repercussion, a kind of ding, 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 like a delay going on. But one of the times I did it, it obviously hit a load of water on the back of the boat.
Mhm.
And yeah, obviously it's not like this massive cruise ship. It's just kind of 30, 35 foot or whatever. Yeah, but it hit bum and there was a drip that came off it. And it was obviously like a bit of water or condensation or something that then hit the sea next to it. And I was like, oh, that was quite cool. Did it again. I was like, oh. But I tried to mic it up and I'm not an audio engineer. And it was pretty shit. So when I came back to the studio, I literally just went into the tap in there and you had the sound of the drip, drip,
Yeah.
drip. You know, and so you try to like you just want one. You don't need a whole load of them. So you could go drip, drip, and you mic it up, and that was all cool. Put it in. I was like, well, that's nice, but it sounds a bit kind of like a kid's show. But you know, if you start again, if you know what I mean, like if you start
Yeah,
mucking
yeah.
around with stuff, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's all about the process. So I was like, okay, well, let's try processing that. And in the same way that you're processing kind of electric cello through
Mhm.
distortion effects or delays or whatever else. So I started putting that, and there's a keyboard over there, one of the many, but it's an old JP8080 and it's got a vocoder on it up there. So you
Okay.
take that sound, you process it through it, and so all of a sudden it doesn't sound like a drip. It's kind of drip, drip, whoop, whoop, in the same way that a voice through a vocoder doesn't sound like a voice after a while. And it starts then becoming this sound. It took about 2 days to do it, which is absolutely insane when you think about it. But you're then combining that, and that combined with the sound on there's a Nord keyboard as well, and you layer the two against each other, and suddenly it's not that people know it, and you don't really do it for that reason.
Yeah.
It's not about, I hate that word authentic. It's not about making it authentic, but it's so that in your head you always start out with a story
Mhm.
as a composer, and it's like, well, what am I going to do with this? How can I make this just not a traditional soundtrack, but something specific to this score? And suddenly, in my head, every time I hear it, whether people notice it or not, but I'm like, oh yeah, yeah. It's not just an electronic keyboard. It's actually got some sort of sound which is it's real. You know, I think sometimes electronica can be so warm, it can be so wonderful, it can be so disgusting and distorted. You can do so many things with it. But I love it when you combine the orchestra with the brass, with the electric cello, with the electronica and the synths and the beats and all of that. Those things come together to create something which takes people on a ride in the same way that the film itself takes people on a ride. And I think it's not about being taken out of the moment as a viewer. It's the opposite. It's about trying to take people in there. I don't want them to notice that I've introduced all of these things,
Mhm.
but you want them to feel that somehow there's an electric cello that's got you on the edge. There's a kind of dripping tap combined with a sound, which gives it a sound of, I don't know why it makes me feel watery. Again, it's weird, but there's got to be something that makes you feel a certain way. So hopefully that contributes to what it was.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that. I've never had like an explanation like that. That was incredible.
Yeah, and then you're going to hear it and go, "Oh, he really shouldn't have bothered."
I don't think so. Well, thank you so much, Paul. This was so fun.
You are more than welcome, and I want video proof of when you do the soprano sets instead of the sousaphone. Right, in 2 years' time, when you've got a bad back, going, "All right, I think I'm going to move on now."